Hello and welcome to episode 276 of AvTalk. I am Ian Petchnick, here as always with
Jason Rabinowitz. Hello, Ian. How are you?
Hello, Jason. I'm well, sir. How are you?
I'm good. Melting a little bit.
A little warm in New York?
Yeah, a little warm in the Northeast, or really, I think the entire continent is disgusting right now. I'm sure Chicago's not much better.
Today is not bad, but it's supposed to get a bit more humid and a bit warmer the rest of the week. So I'm not looking forward to that. I'm already looking forward to winter, in fact.
Yes. I am headed up north this weekend to Canada. It's no improvement there. It's just hot everywhere.
It's the
same thing. But thankfully, the remnants of the hurricane and tropical storm are passing through today and tomorrow, and I'll just miss that, fortunately.
That's good.
Yeah, it's going to be hot. Not as hot as Vegas was the other day. What was it, like
123 degrees Fahrenheit?
That is not okay. Didn't mean to talk about this, but there were impacts to aviation.
We'll take it.
Yeah, some flights couldn't make it to where they needed to go. They couldn't take off at, I guess, that altitude plus that heat plus the runway length. They couldn't make it in. Some flights couldn't make the nonstop. I think there was one particular flight, which I just happened to see, which ended up getting picked up on airliners.net, I think. It was the LA to BWI flight, which I spotted on the ground in Las Vegas because apparently they diverted there because of some sort of customer issue, I think. And then once they were on the ground in Las Vegas, they couldn't make the nonstop with that aircraft all the way to Baltimore, so they had to stop. I think it was in Wichita, where the crew timed out, which is just a really bad day.
Ouch.
Yeah, so there are real impacts. It didn't seem to be very widespread, but a number of flights did have real-world impacts.
We've talked about this before, specifically in the case of Las Vegas, where it was too hot for Norwegian. When they were operating long haul, they had a few issues where they couldn't fly their return Vegas flights because it was just too hot. So yeah, I mean, nothing new, but it sounds like it's only going to get worse. Yeah, today's high for everyone listening to the podcast outside of the US.
And Liberia.
Today's high temperature is 47 degrees. It's going to cool off this weekend, where the high will only be 44 on Saturday and 42. For those listening in the US, 117 today, 112 on Saturday. So good luck to those in Vegas and stay indoors or something.
They know what they signed up for.
There you go. Hey, let's get on to what we thought we were going to talk about, which is the fact that the Boeing Corporation is soon to be a felon. Boeing has agreed to plead guilty to renewed charges stemming from the U.S. Department of Justice finding that they failed to live up to their deferred prosecution agreement. So that deferred prosecution has been undeferred, de-deferred, and is now an agreement. Boeing says, we can confirm that we have reached an agreement in principle on terms of a resolution with the Justice Department, subject to the memorialization and approval of specific terms.
Man, that's one way to put it. I don't think that's what an individual person convicted of a crime in court gets to say. I'm pretty sure you enter your plea as a plea of guilty. Boeing never said that word. They didn't have to come out right and say the words guilty. They spit out some word salad, and apparently that's sufficient.
Well, that's sufficient for a press release. But the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of Texas, which is the controlling court for this case, has until next week, the 19th of July, to approve whatever deal the Department of Justice and Boeing have come to. We don't know the specifics yet from the government, but there has been a lot of reporting around it. And a few of the things that we seem to know are that Boeing will have to pay the other 50% of the original fine. So originally, they were fined just under $500 million. They paid $243.4 million in 2021, and now they will have to pay the other 50%. And so that's another $243.6 million. They'll also have, and we talked about this last week, they'll have an independent monitor put in place, but Boeing gets to choose, or at least pre-select, the possible independent monitors. So we'll see who those folks end up being. We do know that the Boeing board of directors must meet with families of the 737 MAX crash victims from 2018, 2019. And we also know that Boeing will not have to do much other than that. There are no leadership changes mandated. There are no new fines as far as we know. It just seems like kind of a continuation of the original agreement, which was, I think, widely criticized both on this podcast and elsewhere. And it seems like this plea deal is also being roundly criticized elsewhere. And Jason, I'll open up the floor to say, and on this podcast as well.
Yes, of course. This fine is it's not chump change, but I'm sure Boeing could turn over a few couch cushions and find a check to easily write out what they need here. At least we have the moral victory here, I guess, for the families of them getting some closure here, saying Boeing is a convicted felon. It lied to people. It lied to the government. It lied to investigators. It lied to airlines. It lied to pilots. It lied to everyone possible. But I think that the sweetest part of this, forget the monetary fine because it doesn't go to the families, will be the meeting with the board of directors, where I'm sure a lot of eye contact will be, let's say, missing. I can't imagine that meeting is going to be anything but extremely awkward, but it is certainly symbolic and something they've wanted for a long time. And to be a fly on the wall during that meeting, I'm not sure what's exactly is going to happen there, but I can imagine it's going to be interesting.
Yeah, I would bet that there will definitely be a lot of missing eye contact. Yeah,
it's something. I don't feel like anyone wins here.
Yeah,
I don't think that's the goal. It's just that the fine is just, you put it well here in the show notes, tiny fine. It's insignificant. It's not enough to mean anything. And I think we've already seen, what was it?
And don't
Moody's?
take my word for it. RBC Capital Markets, quote, a limited financial impact. Boeing made nearly $80 billion last year.
Yeah. So this it's fairly insignificant. It's a blip on a spreadsheet somewhere. It doesn't matter. I would have hoped to see a higher fine. I'm sure anyone on the families would have hoped for a higher fine, because there are certainly higher fines for other less egregious things out there in this country. But what is, I think, most disheartening is that even though Boeing itself as a corporate entity is going to be deemed a felon, that too will have no real impact, as they can just, I think we talked about this last week, they can just get waivers for any potential government contracts because Boeing is too big to fail. They can't not go through with government contracts in the future. It may be a bit of a pain to secure new ones, a little extra paperwork, but I'm sure they can rustle up the pens to complete that paperwork.
Yeah. So we'll stay on that next week to see. It'll happen. Well, maybe it'll happen before we record next week, but it'll definitely happen within the next 2 weeks, whether or not the judge affirms that plea deal. I suppose there's the outside chance that the judge could say, no, not good enough. But that would be surprising. We now have the NTSB's preliminary report on what was initially described by the pilots as Dutch roll on a Southwest 737-8 MAX. This was a May 25th flight from Phoenix to Oakland. The aircraft, while it cruised at 34,000 feet, suffered what the pilot described as a small amount of Dutch roll. Quote, the roll was stable, more noticeable in frequency, with only a slight amount of yaw. Oscillations lasted only a few seconds, and the autopilot remained engaged throughout the event. The NTSB has put out a preliminary report, which is, I think, it's always interesting to see the direction that an investigation goes. And this one is a particularly interesting investigation because after the flight, Southwest Maintenance took this particular aircraft out of service, where they noticed that a number of components in the rudder system were damaged. While replacing successive components within the rudder system, they kept finding more damaged components. So the NTSB has reconstructed a timeline of events following this particular aircraft, and they go back to May 16th. So this is 9 days before the flight in which the pilots experienced some Dutch roll. On May 16th, at about 17:15 Central Daylight Time, the event airplane was operating as Southwest 621, landed in New Orleans. They moved the aircraft to a remote spot where it stayed for the night. In the morning, the airplane was towed back to the gate and departed the next day as Southwest Flight 450. During the evening, a big storm came through. The peak gust of 73 knots was recorded at 23:36 Central Daylight Time. National Weather Service composite radar mosaic depicted a Boeing segment associated with the squall line around that time. There were SIGMETs for severe thunderstorms with tops up to 45,000 feet and multiple tornado warnings. We'll put a link to the report in the show notes so that you can see the radar mosaic and read through all of the facts and figures for yourselves as well. But the NTSB, obviously this is a preliminary report, so they don't say, we think that this caused it, but we can kind of look to say, oh, they've included this in the preliminary report. This must be an important part of the investigation. Then they go on to walk through, there was maintenance conducted on the aircraft on the 23rd, where the airplane remained in Houston overnight for an A core check. The check was performed in the maintenance hangar, and one of the tests conducted during the maintenance check was an operational test of the standby hydraulic actuation system, which included the test of the standby rudder power control unit, which is one of the damaged pieces in the rudder assembly. And so after this maintenance activity, that's when the aircraft started to experience rudder issues. So the NTSB has traced kind of step by step by step. And I'm always fascinated how they do this and how methodical the NTSB is when they walk through an investigation. And I have to give credit to Southwest on this one too, because they did a very interesting thing. They didn't know if this was a fleet-wide thing. They didn't know if this was something that affected all 737 MAX or anything like that. So they looked over the 3-day period between June 17th and June 20th. They conducted a fleet campaign and inspected each 737 MAX in the Southwest fleet, 231 aircraft, and they did detailed visual inspections. But this is the cool thing. They also took the quick access recorder data for the entire fleet, developed an algorithm based on the flight data recorder information for the event flight where the aircraft experienced Dutch roll, and said, okay, algorithm, look for any of the same patterns in all of the QAR data to see what you can find. The NTSB reports that 3 aircraft were observed to have small rudder oscillations, but without the associated rudder control surface movements that were experienced by the pilots in this aircraft. They were taken out of service and inspected with no additional findings found, and they're continuing to monitor the QAR data. So I thought that was really a great use of all of the digital data that is now available.
Yeah, pretty high tech for what is considered to be a pretty low tech airline. So even though it may not seem like Southwest has all its ducks in a row technology wise, clearly there's a lot more behind the scenes where they could really pull out the stops when they need to. And that's really cool to have a fleet-wide analysis like that to say, hey, did any of our other aircraft in this time frame do the thing this other airplane did? And no. And this is actually probably, I think, what we talked about last week or the week before that may get Southwest into a little bit of trouble, saying that this is a single aircraft issue. There are no other aircraft with this issue. Well, now we know how they determine that by looking at this QAR data.
Yeah, well, that wasn't Southwest saying that. That was Boeing's chief engineer. And that's
okay.
What the NTSB was.
Yes, I got my facts mixed up there. I remember somebody said something they shouldn't have, but almost certainly using the data that Southwest had provided them.
Right. And so if I'm the NTSB and I'm preparing this preliminary report and you as Boeing's engineer says these things, well, we understand why you're saying them, but you're still not allowed to say them.
No. Even now, knowing this, you probably still shouldn't say that, but it's really cool to see this. What's less cool is the images that the NTSB also published alongside the text here. Some pretty gnarly looking cracks in the assembly here, which don't look too great. It really explains why this aircraft was taken out of service and flown back to Boeing to better understand what happened here. Because this isn't like a little hairline fracture. This is significant deformation of metal pieces to the point where you can see right through it, which is not good. At least the bolts are there. Presumably everything that we're supposed to be seeing there is there, but there is really significant deformation to the metal, and I'm sure Boeing wants to figure out, why is this a thing?
Yeah, I'm sure we'll learn more in the final report. We go to Syracuse, of all places now.
Nothing happens in Syracuse, but all right.
Thankfully, nothing happened in Syracuse. But on the 8th of July, so that would be Monday of this week, a Delta flight departing Syracuse and an American flight. These are, hold on, let me back up.
Endeavor
Delta flights.
and PSA flights.
Yes.
They look like Delta and American, but they're not.
I knew I was going to get an email from somebody.
Yeah, pull the mainstream media,
so.
Ian. I can't believe it.
I mean, I at least know what the airplanes look like.
You also know that ready for the sky is not pilot or air traffic control terminology. And if you saw the mainstream news report, you know what I'm talking about.
It should be. I'm sorry. It should be.
Delta Flight 1 ready for the sky.
That should be how
That's a lot better than cleared for takeoff, I have to say.
I mean, it's wrong, sure. And if we're talking about news reports, we should be factually correct. But I think that's a better thing to say.
Yes, as an aside, I think that was the worst, most factually incorrect aviation story I've seen in mainstream media in a long time.
There were some issues there.
There were some issues, and I'm dating that probably the next issue of that caliber was probably the CNN thing where they say, 777 will struggle to fly without fuel. Like, yeah, all right.
Show me the lie, Jason. Show me the lie.
No lies detected. But this one was bad. This report was bad. But Ian, tell us what happened, because the event itself was also bad.
The event itself was also bad, yes. So the Endeavor flight operating for Delta Connection was departing Syracuse for New York, as a PSA flight operating for American Eagle was arriving from Washington. And the PSA flight was cleared to land. At the same time, the Endeavor flight was cleared to depart. And in the air traffic control audio, which was captured by liveatc.net, you can hear the surprise in the PSA crew's voice. It says, who's cleared to depart? Because they're preparing to land on the runway. As soon as they chimed in with that, they were instructed by the tower to go around, at which point they did. However, the Endeavor flight was already most of the way down the runway at this point and continued its takeoff roll. Now, here's where we get into some trouble. Because that aircraft continued to take off, it began to climb directly under the PSA flight. Both of these aircraft are CRJ 900s, and the PSA flight made a left-hand turn. The Endeavor flight made a right-hand turn, and the aircraft began to separate. At their closest point, they were approximately 650 or so feet vertically separated at a nil lateral separation as they both flew the runway centerline and then began to diverge. This all came out because there was video captured by a Syracuse police officer's dash cam for some reason, and it shows the flights. Obviously, the video itself compresses the distance for reasons that science that I don't necessarily have to get into here. But the video makes the flights look closer than they are. However, they were close enough that this is an incident and the FAA is investigating. So the video makes it look like the aircraft are going to crash into each other. That's not the case. By the time that the departing flight arrived at the same altitude that the PSA flight was at, they were a mile apart. So this was not a case of, seconds from disaster, but the aircraft were closer than they should have been. We're still parsing the granular ADSB data, but it does look like at least one of the aircraft received a traffic advisory. So I'm trying to confirm that now, and I'll have more on that next week's episode once we have a closer look at that data. But something to keep an eye on as these things seemingly continue to happen.
Yeah, not great there. Kudos to the PSA crew for being alert, listening to the radio, hearing that something was wrong and doing something about it. Not sure why the Endeavor crew just continued on with their departure. Maybe they weren't instructed to do anything else from the tower. I haven't heard the full live ATC recording, but thankfully everything worked out. And I think, Ian, correct me if I'm wrong, but the minimum vertical separation in an instance like that should be 1,000 feet. So they were well under that.
I don't want to say for sure that that's the case because there are certain criteria.
It's a little more complicated than that.
Yeah, when we're talking about terminal areas and things like that. But that's a great question. And I think we can find out the answer to that from some of our air traffic control friends. So we'll do some research on that and talk more about this next week. Let's head to India now, where we have not one, but two Air India Express stories. Jason, would you like to do fire or failure first?
Oh, well, we got to start with fire because that catches your attention. Unless you're in A320's flight management system or computer, when, fire, no big deal. Don't even have to tell the crew about
it. So an Air India Express A320, as it was climbing out of Bengaluru on the 18th of May, the crew heard a bang from the number 2 engine, which is a CFM 56. And they saw, quote, momentary faults on the N1 speed and in the engine's hydraulic system. They only found out that the engine was in fact on fire when the cabin crew radioed up to say, hey, the engine's on fire.
That's not how you want to discover that. So good job for the cabin crew for seeing something and saying something. I feel like they always do that in this situation, but there probably aren't many instances of the flight crew learning that an engine is on fire from the cabin crew. That is weird. And I'm sure all the investigating bodies here, including Airbus and CFM, will want to know, why wasn't a fire warning triggered here? But thankfully, the flight crew was able to get the aircraft back on the ground very, very quickly. I think the whole flight was something like 18 minutes from up to down, which is pretty great. Very, very strange situation. The AAIB reported with respect to the initial damage assessment that there was no evidence of any damage to the aircraft or number 2 aero engine during visual examination. However, during the boroscopic examination of the engine, number 2, presence of magnetic chips on a magnetic chip detector, metallic strands on number 3, scavenge screen plugs filter were found, blah, 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 blah. So something went wrong here. But apparently there was no visual issue, which is just really, really weird. The whole scene here, the whole story is very, very strange. But thankfully, all 179 passengers and 6 crew members were safely evacuated. And hey, that's a pretty healthy load for that flight. I didn't even know that Air India Express operated A320s, but apparently these used to belong...
These were the Air Asia India A320s.
Aircraft. Yep. Yeah, so that's fun. I learned that. That's exciting.
So, Jason, it was less than 18 minutes. They were on the ground in 13 minutes.
Hey, that's even better. Pretty great. Excellent work by the crew and air traffic control and the airport and everyone getting that aircraft back on the ground. A fire that you don't know is there is obviously a very dangerous situation. So good job for everyone involved in that. Should we get to the other less good
job news? Yes.
Yeah. Tell us about that.
Well, this one is also a CFM 56 engine, but it's on an Air India Express Boeing 737-800. This is the report on a December 26th, 2022 incident. VTAYC took off from Tiruchirappalli on a flight to Singapore, and the crew heard a thud sound, followed by a sharp reduction in N1 speed of the number 1, so the left engine, falling from 98% of N1 to 65% of N1. The fuel flow on that engine dropped rapidly, and the engine got very, very hot. Exhaust gas temperatures shot up to 913 degrees Celsius.
Ooh, feels like Vegas in that engine.
Yes. Vibrations increased, and the crew idled the engine. They diverted to Chennai. No one was injured. But then, after landing, an inspection revealed damage to the 3rd and 4th stage low-pressure turbine rotors and stators with missing materials and a lot of, this is a quote now, missing materials and a lot of broken pieces between the 4th stage stator and rotor. A lot of broken pieces. I'm not...
It's a technical term. You don't use that all the time. That is the
quote from the report.
Mm-hmm. But here's where it gets interesting. Up until this point, everything is kind of normal. The crew, in this case, they did good. Engine failure happened. The crew did what they were supposed to do, what they're trained to do, and they got the aircraft down. Good job. What the investigation takes exception to here is that this should never have happened. The DGCA found that CFM, through its monitoring portal, knew that, hey, there's something going on with this engine, and you should probably take a look at it. CFM had issued a customer notification report on the 20th of December, 6 days before the incident flight, warning of degraded performance on the aircraft's number one engine. It goes on to say, and I'm reading a summarization from Flight Global, work was planned to follow up on the CNR and other aircraft maintenance items, but owing to aircraft movement changes and a lack of ground time, these did not take place. The DGCA, however, believes that there were two periods when the aircraft was on the ground long enough for the work to have been conducted. In addition, they found that the My CFM portal, which monitors engine health, showed a series of alerts flagging the aircraft's degrading performance before the incident flight, but that these were missed by the carrier's maintenance team. And I'm quoting the quote from the article of the DGCA. This implies that there is no proper monitoring of the My CFM portal to analyze the performance degradation by the concerned department. That's really troubling. These engines and aircraft in particular spit out a ton of data, and airlines pay a pretty penny to have access to that data to prevent issues like this, and to have your engine manufacturer in its portal say, hey, there's something going on with this engine, you should probably take a look right away. And for the airline to just not do it is really not good. So the article says that the DGCA warns that further action may follow. Don't know what that will be, but yeah, not good to ignore warnings from your engine manufacturer that there's something going on and you should take a look right away, and then you just don't. Really makes you wonder how long they would have gone with this aircraft before actually taking a look. But this event was back in 2022, so hopefully a year and a half later at this point, there are refined procedures in place to not let that happen again.
Yeah. These portals are designed to yell at you if something is bad.
Having not had any dealings with the My CFM portal, if it's anything like anything else that I use on my day-to-day basis, let's say if I submit an expense report and I forget the date on something, there's a big red flashing triangle. And that's just for a date. If your engine on an aircraft is having serious issues, I'd imagine it's going to get your attention unless you are just straight up not looking at it at all or just outright ignoring it, both of which are very not good.
All right. Let's go to New Caledonia, shall we?
What?
Or maybe not right now, given the political situation. But we do have a report from there, which some pilot actions seem to have resulted in a good ending. Jason, tell me more.
Sure. So the flight crew of a Twin Otter on approach to, I'm not exactly sure, to Point Valley Airport. I'm sorry, I probably butchered that one. On a cargo flight way back in May 2021, if you can even remember those days. They were on approach and they went to increase the speed by 10 knots. The Twin Otter's speed increased to 90 knots as it descended through 400 feet. Again, reading a summary from those guys at Flight Global. They've got everything. And then the captain retarded the throttle levers to idle. But then when they advanced the throttles, nothing happened. The speed kept reducing. The aircraft continued to slow. The captain made several inputs to the throttle levers until they reached full power, but that seemed to have no effect. Speed bled away down to 62 knots. At this point, you're approaching stall speed, which is 56 knots for this aircraft. That's when things got a little dicey. And the pilots decided, well, we're going to put the aircraft into a nose-down attitude to maintain some sort of speed above 56 knots. And they were able to basically aerodynamically get the aircraft down onto the runway undamaged, unharmed, which is really, really cool because we've seen some instances recently where pilots may not be doing exactly what they should do. And in this case, they did exactly what they should do. They put the aircraft into nose down attitude to prevent the stall, to gain airspeed. And thankfully, they were close enough into the runway that they were able to do that and then just happily end up on the runway. Unfortunately, the aircraft was not equipped with flight recorders, so the inquiry relied only on crew testimony, but seems like all's well that ends well, I guess.
Yeah, I guess. Hopefully they just fix the plane.
Yeah. I guess so. They said that there had been 4 malfunctions related to engine power problems on the ground in the past, but technicians were not able to reproduce those in subsequent maintenance operations. Isn't that just a bug that you hate to hear, that this keeps happening, but every time a technician gets on board to try to troubleshoot it, they can't reproduce it? How many times does that happen to you, Ian?
All the time.
Usually when you call like the cable company and they come out and everything's working, the minute they leave, it stops working again.
Exactly.
But this time it was on an airplane. But apparently it happened in the air this time, and thankfully it was all good. But really wanted to just read that story because it's just a nice feel-good story about a pilot doing what a pilot should do, and everything was okay.
I'll take it.
Okay.
I want to hear a story that I find almost unbelievable.
Nearly unbelievable, except it's happened before. But we are talking about Aer Lingus' ongoing industrial action, I think is what they call it by the pilots. Let's just call it a strike. But Aer Lingus is so desperate, so desperate for lift at this point that it has turned to arch rival Ryanair to operate some of its flights upcoming. Well, by the time this podcast comes out, it will have already happened. So we'll have to actually see if it does happen, because sometimes things change, but it's in the schedule. It's there. You can book it right now. Aer Lingus will turn to Ryanair to operate a pair of flights on Thursday and Friday of this week, EI 262, 263, 604, 605 to Birmingham and Amsterdam. Yeah, I'm just kind of surprised that at this point, Ryanair even has the spare capacity to do this, and that Ryanair wouldn't just gloat about it on Twitter incessantly.
I wonder if they put that in the contract.
No gloating on Twitter.
Put it on Twitter.
I mean, it's, again, kind of a feel-good story. Arch rivals coming together to help each other out. Well, I guess it's just Ryanair helping out Aer Lingus, but that is really a sign of sheer desperation, because it's high summer in Europe. There isn't much excess capacity out there from any airline to operate on behalf of Aer Lingus, but it must pain Aer Lingus to call in an arch enemy like this to help out. But hey, you love that spirit.
I mean, maybe Spirit could offer some planes.
No, they have none to spare.
They have no planes. Okay.
None to spare. We know that.
Fair enough. Jason, you and I are old. You know how I know this?
So old, because we could see that time is a flat circle.
Time is indeed a flat circle. And we're also old enough to remember when Middle Eastern airlines were going to ruin the future and fortunes of U.S. carriers such as Delta, United, and American. We've since seen United partner with Emirates, American and Qatar deepen their relationship. And this week, Delta said, sure, why not? And went, if not all in, then about as close to all in as you can get on new Saudi Arabian carrier, Riyadh Air. So far to say that they want to form a joint venture.
Yeah. So it's not even that long ago. You don't have to go that far back to see Delta, and not just Delta, but all the US 3, American and United, in a bitter war with the Middle Eastern carriers. There's this video that we can link to from 2017, a 15-minute long internal, published externally video from Delta that just goes on about how the Middle Eastern carriers have all these illegal state subsidies, and they're coming to kill you all, and it's going to be awful, and they're going to take all our jobs. And now in 2024, Delta is the last of the US 3 to come out with some sort of relationship with a Middle Eastern airline. But this one goes well above and beyond, Ian, like you said, what United has with Emirates and American has with Qatar. This is more than just, a code share and some interlines, and we're going to have some frequent flyer benefits between airlines. They're going for, and I quote here, subject to regulatory approvals, includes interline and code share connectivity, as well as a deeper partnership encompassing loyalty, customer experience, digital transformation, and broader aviation services such as maintenance, repair and overhaul services, ground handling, and training. In the future, the airlines tend to explore an immunized joint venture to further expand the partnership to allow collaboration on network planning and growth in the region. Reading this, knowing the past not too distant history about this is just kind of mind-blowing that Delta would be not just partnering with a Middle Eastern airline and not just partnering with a new 100% state-backed airline, but to this degree, it seems like basically it will be Delta, Air France, KLM, and Riyadh Air in kind of the same vein here. It's a very unexpectedly deep partnership.
I think it's also worth pointing out that Saudi Arabian Airlines is a member of SkyTeam.
It is, but a few people brought that up on Twitter this week, and I'd like to also remind listeners here that, yes, Saudia is in SkyTeam, but it's like one of those other SkyTeam airlines to Delta. They don't even have any code share agreements. I don't believe there are any Saudia flights with the Delta code on it, and I don't think there are any the other way around as well. So while they may have like the base SkyTeam benefits, these are not two airlines that work closely together at all. Kind of like American and Qatar before American and Qatar both in one world decided that they wanted to work very closely. Delta and Saudi are basically just, they happen to be in the same after-school club, kind of.
But they don't hang out at the same table.
No, they don't know each other. They're not even in the same grade. But this is very surprising to see such a deep integration, planning to have such a deep integration. So Delta will even plan on flying from somewhere in the US to Riyadh, which is not something I would have expected to say a year or two ago. That's kind of crazy to me. But Delta will fly to Riyadh at some point, and its passengers can connect on to wherever Riyadh Air ends up flying, and the other way around. When Riyadh Air flies to the US, those passengers can connect onward on Delta to wherever it is Delta flies, maybe even Syracuse.
Yes, the old Riyadh, New York, Syracuse, or
Sure.
Riyadh, Atlanta, Syracuse flights. Let's stick with Delta and talk about, well, more than a dozen passengers who had to be attended by medics because of, I'm not talking about like, it was a little off.
The food
Having
tasted
seen the pictures, it was not good.
I personally felt a bit nauseous for a little while after seeing those photos.
Looking at the photos.
Just looking at it. So this happened just after we recorded, I think. A Delta flight from, I believe, Detroit to Amsterdam returned to Detroit after some passengers became ill.
Diverted to New York.
New York, thank you. It was a Detroit-Amsterdam flight diverted back to New York, where all good flights end. And news came out that, yeah, there was something wrong with the food and passengers became sick. This is not terribly rare. This happens. Passengers get sick and flights divert all the time. What was rare here is the state of the food served on board. In economy, a couple of the dishes were not just a little moldy, they were farming penicillin in that galley.
It was pure science experiment.
It was bad, and apparently enough people ate the extremely moldy food and became sick. And before you jump to any conclusions, if you've been on a transatlantic flight, you know that the cabin can get quite dark. It's not always easy to turn on the overhead light, and you just kind of poke around the dish hoping for the best when the blue mood lighting turns everything in front of you kind of a shade of blue. So I could understand how some passengers didn't notice the food was a little fuzzier than it should have been, a little bluer than it should have been. But wow, the amount of failures that had to happen to get that food on board and served to passengers by no fault of the crew, because remember, the crew is not opening economy meals. They put it in the steam ovens, they put them on the racks, and then they distribute them to passengers, and passengers actually open the tinfoil or whatever pack. So this is of no fault of the crew, but somewhere along the way, the cold chain broke down, or the cart with these meals got locked in a cabinet or a closet for a week and somehow find its way onto the flight. Not good. A lot of things had to go wrong for that cart with very old food to be loaded onto an aircraft. But just maybe don't look at the pictures.
I guess we'll put these in the show. Like, if you have a strong stomach and really want to see it, we'll link to the photos.
I wouldn't recommend it, but yeah, wow.
If you've ever left something, out and it's grown mold like that. That's what it
No,
looks like.
it's never happened to me. Not to that degree. This was
Well, that's fair.
this was way worse than anything that's come out of my fridge.
Okay. Hey, we made it to the end, but we're still talking about Delta. Jason, why?
Well, I heard you are a big fan of the CRJ200. And you are going to love the news that Delta is bringing it back from retirement because it has no choice.
Long sigh.
Yeah, this has been rumored for a little while, but Zach Griff on Twitter published a tweet saying this month Delta will redeploy the CRJ200 on a handful of SkyWest routes out of Detroit and Salt Lake City. The CRJ200 was unceremoniously retired at the beginning of this year, but apparently Delta/SkyWest needs more capacity. I think they were hoping to have some 50-seat CRJ 550 conversions ready by now, but I guess those are behind a little bit.
The first one just went into service last week.
Yeah,
SkyWest.
so they probably plan to have a little bit more because those are also 50-seat regional jets somehow. But yeah, if you're flying out of Detroit or Salt Lake City on a SkyWest operated Delta flight, you may find yourself on a CRJ200. I am sorry.
That's just cruel.
It's unfortunate.
It's not unusual, but it's just cruel.
Having spent a lot of time on Delta CRJ200s, I apologize on their behalf if you end up on one. It's not a nice experience.
For everything that's about to happen to you.
Ugh.
Oh, boy, oh, boy, oh, boy. Well, that's episode 276. Just a few housekeeping reminders. Let's see. Farnborough's coming up. If you're going to be at the Farnborough Air Show, drop us a note at podcast@fr24.com. Jason and I will not be there, unfortunately, this year, but my colleague Chris will be. So you can get in contact with him directly, or we'll put you in contact with him if you're going to be there and would like to meet up. I will be up at Oshkosh on the 27th of July, all day. Email us podcast@fr24.com if you would like to meet up as well. I know there's a few of us already. We're trying to get a time together. So the more the merrier, and looking forward to seeing everyone up there. But for now, I am Ian Petchnick, here as always with
Jason Rabinowitz. Thanks for listening.